At first, this sounds simple, but the more you listen to what Brian Hooker says happened, the harder it is to picture. The moment she goes overboard isn't exactly clear, and what happens afterward is hard to follow. And most importantly, the parts where you would expect the most details, these parts are hard to understand. And you start to feel it. This doesn't quite add up. This story is confusing. This explanation isn't feeling like it makes sense. I'm Dr. Seth, psychologist. Let's go to point number one. One thing that's important to note is a detail as important as were they actually wearing life vests? This detail actually hasn't been confirmed by the Royal Bahamas Police, which of course took information and has been interviewing Brian Hooker. So that detail has not been confirmed, but what little bit we do know is that it does appear that he did throw a flotation device to her, or he reported attempting to throw it. Now, people listening to this story, of course, are thinking you're out on the water in a small dinghy. I think this is an 8-foot dinghy. How could anyone be in such a position and not wear a flotation device? Brian Hooker had reported that there were strong winds and strong currents at this time. One would imagine, using rational, linear thinking, that anyone in such conditions with choppy waters and intense winds would immediately, if they hadn't been already wearing a life vest, would immediately put one on. So right there, that point becomes confusing to the brain when the brain hears this information. So right there, that is the first point where people listening to the story are thinking, how does this make sense? Somehow it doesn't quite add up. Second, there's a report that alcohol may have been involved. And of course, we know that alcohol can impair judgment, can impair decision making. Now, a security guard who had reportedly encountered Brian Hooker after the incident shared that Brian Hooker stated that they had been drinking. Crucial reality check when it comes to boating and alcohol. Alcohol is often involved in boating accidents. According to some 2023 data from the U.S. Coast Guard, for example, alcohol is the number one contributing factor in fatal boating accidents. Also, check this out. About 17 to 20% of all boating deaths involve alcohol. So, as you are listening to the explanation from Brian Hooker about what happened, it is important to remember that data. Third factor we're going to review in how this case seems so confusing, how the explanation doesn't quite seem to make sense. Brian Hooker reported that the key to the boat, to the dinghy, was with his wife, Lynette, when she went overboard, causing the engine to quit. Again, you listening to this explanation, of course, might be thinking, why would anyone on a boat have the key on their person? Again, especially in strong winds, especially in difficult weather conditions, when one would understand that accidents can happen. Why would somebody have the key on their person? When you hear that explanation, it simply may not make sense to you. Fourth factor I want to review. He reportedly lost one of the oars. So imagine the engine no longer is workable. And so you're left there in a dinghy. Your wife is overboard. And all of a sudden, you also happen to lose a second oar, which means, of course, your ability to move through the water would be incredibly restricted. Well, you listening to this additional factor, if you are engaging in rational thinking, you are looking at all of the puzzle pieces that you are trying to work together and put into a rational understanding of what happened so that things make sense. And when you hear that detail, that one oar, really, in order to row anywhere effectively, you would really need two. Well, one oar went overboard. Again, the addition, the accumulation of yet another factor that doesn't quite seem to make sense. Each gets stacked on the other, adding up to this sense of greater confusion. And the fifth factor that I want to review, which is also the most important, is that the outcome is so incredibly different for the two people involved in this situation. The two people involved, Brian Hooker and his wife, Lynette. One survived, and the other is missing now for days. So, part of when you hear this explanation of what happened, part of why it can cause confusion for you is because the outcomes for the two individuals were so incredibly different. And because the outcomes were so incredibly different, someone listening to the explanation, trying to make sense of how it is that these two individuals' outcomes were so incredibly different, well, when all of the factors that have been reported are stacked on each other, each factor seeming, feeling on a common sense basis, unlikely or confusing, all of a sudden, the different outcomes cause a stronger response, causing the average person to make a determination about whether they feel this explanation makes sense or simply doesn't add up. Psychologically, listening to the explanation of what happened, psychologically, the confusion is important. Human beings are incredibly sensitive to a mismatch when maybe the tone of something doesn't quite add up, when the facts don't seem to make sense or feel plausible or realistic. Human beings are wired to sense there is a mismatch when something serious happens, something as serious as potential death, someone missing at sea. Human beings want there to be an explanation that feels rational. This is the human being's drive to make sense of things and install some degree of order when a situation feels chaotic or out of control, as is the case with someone going missing. When something serious happens and the explanation doesn't feel sufficient, people can feel it. Signals, very strong signals, go off in people's brains that let them know there were too many gaps or details are too unclear, that something may be off or something may be wrong. One of the things that's important to note, when there are gaps in a narrative, when there are gaps in an explanation of what happened, when something is very serious, those gaps create a sense of stress or tension in those who hear about it, in those who learn about it. And that stress is about needing, seeking some kind of clear, rational resolution. In closing, what Brian Hooker shared happened may have been exactly what happened. But what's important for people to understand when they have some of the strong reactions people in the public have had as a result of this story being shared in the media, what's important is for people to understand that the signals that go off when they feel that confusion, that sense that something's not adding up, they are often responding to some sense of a threat to the truth, a threat to the integrity of what really actually happened. Again, we don't know the facts, what happened in the case with Brian and Lynette Hooker. But one thing that you can do, you listening to the story, listening to what happened, thinking about it, one of the things that you can do is reflect on how would you feel? What sense would you make of this if these were individuals that you knew in your own personal life? If this was a family member and the situation was very unclear, you didn't have all the data that you needed to make a clear determination. You felt you couldn't know for sure what happened. If this were a close friend, how would you make sense of it? These things do happen to people in real life. Brian Hooker is a real individual, Lynette Hooker as well. Psychologically, I'll share as my final point, it is important to have psychological flexibility, especially when all the details are not clear. Although you may have an intuition about something that happens in your personal life, about what really happened, an intuition. If you don't have all of the data, if you don't have all of the facts, it can also be really important to allow space for the possibility that something different may have happened as well. That is psychological flexibility. We may learn more details about what happened in this incident with Brian and Lynette Hooker. My heart goes out to those who know and love and care about Lynette Hooker, and I know the public feels similarly. I'm Dr. Seth, psychologist.